Blood soaked the dry earth like a prayer no one wanted to hear. Rosa Delgado lay crumpled between the sagebrush and barbed wire, her dark hair matted with dust and crimson, while the New Mexico sun burned mercilessly overhead. She had crossed into a land that didn't want her, carrying nothing but hope and a bullet in her shoulder. When Jacob Turner found her, his weathered hands trembling as he knelt beside her broken form, the world held its breath. Every neighbor would demand he turn her over to the authorities. Every friend would call him a fool. Every voice of reason would scream that harboring a Mexican fugitive meant his own destruction. But as her eyes fluttered open and met his, something ancient and unbreakable stirred in his chest, a promise that would cost him everything he'd ever known. The morning Jacob Turner discovered Rosa Delgado bleeding in his north pasture, the sky hung low and colorless, like old canvas stretched too thin over the bones of the earth. He had been riding the fence line, checking for breaks where cattle might wander into the disputed territory that bordered Mexico, when his horse suddenly shied and snorted, ears pricked forward toward a dark shape crumpled near the mesquite. At first, he thought it might be a calf that had wandered too far from the herd, but as he dismounted and approached, the shape resolved into something that made his breath catch in his throat. A woman lay motionless among the thorns, her white blouse stained crimson, her long black hair spread like spilled ink across the red dirt. Jacob had been alone on his ranch for 3 years, ever since consumption took his wife Sarah and left him with nothing but empty rooms and the endless work of keeping cattle alive in this unforgiving land. He had grown accustomed to silence, to the company of his own thoughts and the distant lowing of his herd, but the sight of this wounded stranger shattered that solitude like a stone through glass. She was young, perhaps 23, with skin the color of desert sand and features that spoke of a heritage this territory had been trying to erase for decades. Blood seeped from a wound in her left shoulder, and her breathing came in shallow, desperate gasps that seemed to pull at something deep in his chest. As he knelt beside her, Jacob's hands moved with the careful precision of a man who had tended wounded animals his entire life. But this was different. This was a human being, a woman who had somehow found her way onto his land, carrying a bullet and a story he couldn't yet imagine. Her eyelids fluttered, revealing dark eyes that held a mixture of pain and defiance, and when she tried to speak, only a whisper emerged, words in Spanish that he couldn't understand, but that sounded like a prayer or a plea. The sun climbed higher, casting harsh shadows across her face, and Jacob realized that every moment he spent here increased the chances that someone would see them, that questions would be asked, that choices would have to be made. He thought of his neighbors, men like Bill Hawthorne and Tom Morrison, who had fought in the war and came home with hearts full of suspicion and anger toward anyone who looked like the enemy they'd been taught to hate. He thought of Sheriff Coleman, who had made it clear that Mexican fugitives were to be turned over to the authorities without question, no matter their condition or their story. He thought of the unspoken rules that governed this harsh land, rules that said a man protected his own and viewed strangers as threats to be eliminated or expelled. But as he looked down at Rosa's face, pale now from blood loss, something in him rebelled against those rules with a force that surprised him. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain, and Jacob made a decision that would change the course of both their lives. He gathered Rosa into his arms, feeling how light she was, how fragile, and carried her toward his horse with the careful tenderness of a man handling something precious and breakable. She stirred against his chest, her hand clutching weakly at his shirt, and he found himself whispering words of comfort in English, hoping that his tone would convey what his language could not. The ranch house stood in the distance, a small adobe structure that had sheltered him through 3 lonely years, and as he rode toward it with Rosa cradled against him, he knew he was crossing a line from which there would be no return. When they reached the house, Jacob carried her inside to the bedroom that had once belonged to him and Sarah, laying her gently on the quilt his wife had sewn during the long winter, before her death. The room smelled of dust and disuse, but it was clean and cool, with thick walls that would muffle any sounds from the outside world. As he began to tend to Rosa's wound, cleaning it with whiskey and binding it with strips torn from his own shirts, he felt the weight of the choice he had made settling around him like a heavy coat. By nightfall, someone would notice his absence from the usual gathering at Morrison's store, and by tomorrow, questions would begin to circulate about why Jacob Turner had been seen riding hard toward his house in the middle of the day. Rosa's fever broke on the third day, and when she opened her eyes fully for the first time, Jacob was sitting beside the bed, reading from a book of poetry that had belonged to Sarah. The afternoon light filtered through the small window, casting golden rectangles across the wooden floor, and for a moment neither of them spoke, each taking the measure of the other in the quiet sanctuary of the room. She tried to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at her wounded shoulder, and Jacob immediately set down the book, reaching out to steady her with hands that were gentle despite their calluses and scars. When she spoke, her English was accented but clear, each word carefully chosen and delivered with a dignity that seemed to fill the small room. "You could have left me to die," she said, her dark eyes searching his face for something he couldn't name. "Your people, they would say you should have." Jacob felt the truth of her words settle in his chest, like a stone, heavy and undeniable, because she was right. Everything about his upbringing, his community, his place in this harsh social order said that he should have ridden past her bleeding form and reported it to the sheriff as someone else's problem. But he had not. And now they were bound together by that choice, by the secret of her presence in his house, and the growing certainty that he would do it again, would make the same choice every time, regardless of the consequences. He told her his name, and she told him hers, and in that simple exchange something shifted between them, a recognition that went deeper than words or circumstances. Rosa had been running, she explained, from men who had killed her brother and burned her family's small farm near the border. Men who wore badges but acted like bandits, taking what they wanted and destroying what they couldn't use. She had crossed into New Mexico hoping to find work, to disappear into the vast landscape and build a new life from the ashes of the old. But the bullet that found her shoulder had come from the gun of a rancher who shot first and asked questions later when he saw a Mexican woman on his land. As the days passed and Rosa grew stronger, Jacob found himself drawn into conversations that revealed the depth of her intelligence and the strength of her spirit. She had been educated by nuns in a convent school, could read and write in both Spanish and English, and possessed a knowledge of herbs and healing that proved invaluable as she helped him tend to a sick calf and treat a cut on his hand that had become infected. But more than her practical skills, it was her presence that began to transform the empty spaces of his house, filling them with a warmth he had forgotten existed, with laughter that echoed off the adobe walls and made the rooms feel alive again. The outside world, however, was growing suspicious. Bill Hawthorne had ridden by twice, ostensibly to check on Jacob's welfare, but really to peer through windows and ask pointed questions about why Jacob hadn't been seen in town for over a week. Tom Morrison had sent his son with a message about a missing Mexican woman, wanted for questioning in connection with some unspecified crime, and the boy had lingered on the porch, trying to see into the house while Jacob stood firmly in the doorway, blocking his view. Sheriff Coleman himself had stopped by, his pale eyes scanning the property while he made casual conversation about cattle thieves and border troubles, and Jacob had felt sweat gathering between his shoulder blades as he maintained the fiction that everything was normal, that he was simply a grieving widower going about his solitary business. But it was in the evenings, when the work was done, and they sat together on the small porch watching the sun set over the endless expanse of desert, that Jacob felt the full weight of what was happening between them. Rosa would tell him stories of her childhood, of festivals and family gatherings, of a world rich with color and music and connection, and he would share memories of Sarah, of the dreams they had harbored for this land, of the loneliness that had settled over him like dust after her death. Their conversations grew deeper, more intimate, and Jacob began to understand that what he felt for Rosa was not merely compassion or protectiveness, but something far more dangerous and transformative. On the night she first reached out and took his hand as they sat watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, Jacob knew that he had crossed another line, one that led not just to social ostracism, but to something that could cost him his life. In this territory, in this time, a white man who harbored a Mexican fugitive was suspect enough, but a white man who loved one was a traitor to his own kind, a violation of the natural order that demanded swift and violent correction. Yet as Rosa's fingers intertwined with his, warm and alive and trusting, Jacob found that he no longer cared about the consequences, that he would stand against the entire world if necessary to protect what was growing between them in the quiet sanctuary of his ranch. The town of Mesilla buzzed with the kind of vicious energy that comes when decent people convince themselves that cruelty is justice. Jacob felt their eyes on him as he loaded supplies into his wagon, felt the weight of their whispers like stones against his back. Mrs. Henderson turned away when he tipped his hat, her mouth pursed in righteous disapproval. The blacksmith's hammer rang harder against the anvil, each strike a metallic condemnation. Even the children seemed to sense the shift, pointing and giggling behind their mother's skirts, as if Jacob had become something strange and dangerous overnight. He had come to town for medical supplies and food, but mostly he had come to gauge the temperature of their hatred. What he found was worse than he had imagined. Sheriff Morrison approached with the slow, deliberate gait of a man who had made up his mind about something unpleasant. His badge caught the harsh afternoon sun, throwing sharp reflections that seemed to cut through the dusty air between them. "Jacob," he said, his voice carrying the weight of old friendship strained to breaking. "Folks are saying you're harboring that Mexican girl, saying she's the one who was running with those cattle thieves last month." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Jacob felt something cold settle in his chest. Not fear, but a kind of crystalline clarity that comes when a man realizes he has crossed a line from which there is no return. "Folks say a lot of things, Bill," he replied, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Doesn't make them true." The sheriff's eyes, once warm with shared memories of better times, now held the flat hardness of duty. "You know I got to investigate, Jacob. Can't have people thinking the law plays favorites." The words were reasonable, even kind, but Jacob heard the threat beneath them, like the rattle of a snake in tall grass. As he drove the wagon home through the endless expanse of sage and sand, Jacob felt the weight of his choice settling around him like chains. The horizon stretched before him, vast and indifferent, offering no answers to the questions that gnawed at his conscience. He thought of Sarah, of the promises he had made at her graveside, of the man he had been before loneliness had carved him hollow. Would she understand what he was doing, or would she see it as a betrayal of everything they had built together? The wind carried the scent of distant rain, a promise that might never be fulfilled, and Jacob wondered if he was chasing the same kind of impossible hope. Rosa was sitting on the porch when he returned, her dark hair catching the golden light of late afternoon like spun silk. She had found one of Sarah's old dresses, a simple blue cotton that transformed her from wounded fugitive to something achingly beautiful and heartbreakingly vulnerable. The sight of her stopped Jacob's breath in his throat, not just because of her beauty, but because of the way she looked at him, with a trust so complete it felt like a sacred responsibility. "They know about me," she said, her voice soft but certain. It wasn't a question. She had read the truth in his face the moment he stepped down from the wagon. "Let them know," Jacob said, surprised by the fierceness in his own voice. He climbed the steps slowly, each board creaking under his weight, like the settling of old bones. "This is my land, Rosa, my choice." She stood as he approached, and for a moment they were close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes, could smell the faint scent of the lavender soap she had found in Sarah's things. The air between them hummed with possibility and danger, with the electric tension of two souls recognizing something in each other that the world would never understand or forgive. That night, as thunder rolled across the desert without bringing rain, Jacob lay awake listening to the sound of Rosa moving quietly through the house. She was restless too, he realized, caught between gratitude and guilt, between the safety he offered and the danger her presence brought to his door. When morning came, pale and unforgiving, Jacob knew that whatever peace they had found in these stolen days was about to be shattered, that the world was closing in around them with the inexorable certainty of a noose drawing tight. The riders came at dawn, their silhouettes black against the bleeding sky like harbingers of Judgment Day. Jacob counted 8 men, maybe 9, their faces hidden beneath the brims of their hats, but their intentions clear in the rigid set of their shoulders and the way their hands rested easy on their gun belts. He had been expecting this moment since his return from town, had felt it building like pressure before a storm. But the reality of it still hit him like a physical blow. Rosa appeared beside him at the window, her face pale but determined, and Jacob felt a surge of protective fury, so intense it made his hands shake. Sheriff Morrison rode at the front of the group, his badge glinting like a star fallen to earth and tarnished by the dust of compromise. Behind him came the faces Jacob recognized from a lifetime of shared struggles, men who had helped him raise his barn, who had stood beside Sarah's grave, who had once called him friend. Now they looked at his house like it harbored something diseased, their eyes hard with the kind of righteousness that makes good men do terrible things. "Jacob Turner," Morrison called out, his voice carrying across the yard with official authority. "We need to talk." Jacob stepped onto the porch, feeling the weight of Rosa's gaze on his back like a blessing and a burden. The morning air was crisp with the promise of heat to come, and somewhere in the distance a hawk circled with patient hunger. "My porch is as good a place as any for talking, Bill," he said, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. The sheriff dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and careful, while the other men remained in their saddles like a jury of the damned. "You know why we're here, Jacob. That girl you're hiding, she's wanted for questioning in connection with the cattle rustling that's been plaguing this county." The accusation hung in the air like the scent of smoke, acrid and choking. Jacob felt Rosa tense behind the door, felt her fear like a living thing that clawed at his chest. "She's not hiding," he said, his voice gaining strength with each word. "She's recovering from a bullet wound on my property, under my protection." Morrison's face tightened with something that might have been regret or might have been anger. "Jacob, you're making this harder than it needs to be. Just let us talk to her, get her side of the story. If she's innocent, she's got nothing to fear." But Jacob had lived long enough to know that innocence was a luxury the powerless could rarely afford, that justice was often just another word for the will of the strong imposed upon the weak. "She stays here," he said, and the finality in his voice seemed to echo across the desert like the crack of a whip. One of the mounted men, a rancher named Caldwell, whose cattle had been among those stolen, spat into the dust with disgust. "You've lost your mind, Turner. That Mexican witch has bewitched you, made you forget your duty to your own kind." The words hit Jacob like a slap, not because they hurt, but because they revealed the ugly truth that had always lurked beneath the surface of their community's civility. He thought of Rosa's gentle hands tending his small garden, of the way she hummed while she cooked, of the stories she told about her family in Mexico, stories that painted her not as a witch or a criminal, but as a young woman driven by desperation and hope. "My duty," Jacob said, his voice low and dangerous, "is to protect the innocent and defend what's right. If you can't see that, then you never knew me at all." But the standoff stretched like a taut wire, each second heavy with the possibility of violence. Jacob could feel the weight of his rifle just inside the door, could sense Rosa's presence like a flame that needed protecting from the wind. Then Morrison sighed, a sound like air escaping from a punctured dream, and remounted his horse. "This isn't over, Jacob," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of old friendship dying. "The law will have its due, one way or another." As the riders wheeled their horses and disappeared into the shimmering heat of the rising day, Jacob felt something fundamental shift inside him, felt the last ties to his old life snap like dried leather in the desert sun. In the aftermath of the confrontation, the house seemed to hold its breath, as if the very walls were waiting for the next blow to fall. Rosa emerged from the shadows where she had been listening, her face a map of emotions too complex for words, gratitude and guilt warring with something deeper, something that made Jacob's chest tighten with recognition. She moved toward him with the careful grace of a deer approaching water, uncertain whether safety or danger waited at the edge of the clearing. "You could have given me to them," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It would have been easier." Jacob turned from the window where he had been watching the dust settle in the wake of the departed riders. The morning light caught the planes of his face, highlighting the new lines that worry and sleepless nights had carved there. "Easy isn't always right," he said, and the simple truth of it seemed to fill the space between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Rosa stepped closer, close enough that he could see the way her pulse fluttered at the base of her throat, could smell the faint scent of sage that clung to her hair from her walks in his garden. "In my country," she said, her voice gaining strength, "we have a saying, el corazón no entiende de fronteras, the heart understands no borders." "Why?" Her hand rose as if of its own accord, hovering just inches from his chest, and Jacob felt the heat of her palm like a brand against his skin, even through the fabric of his shirt. The air between them crackled with electricity, with the dangerous magnetism of two souls recognizing their other half across the vast loneliness of the world. When her fingers finally made contact, pressing gently over his heart, Jacob felt something inside him break open like a dam, giving way to flood. He caught her hand in his, marveling at the delicate strength of her fingers, at the way they fit against his palm, as if they had been carved from the same piece of wood. "Rosa," he said, her name a prayer and a promise on his lips. She looked up at him with eyes that held the depth of desert nights, eyes that had seen too much sorrow for someone so young, but still held the capacity for hope. "I know this is wrong," she whispered, but even as she spoke the words, she was moving closer, drawn by the same inexorable force that pulls rivers toward the sea. Their first kiss was tentative, a question asked in the language of touch, and answered with the soft sigh that escaped Rosa's lips. Jacob felt the world tilt on its axis, felt 20 years of careful control crumble like sandcastles before the tide. Her mouth was warm and sweet, tasting of the honey she had drizzled over their breakfast biscuits, and when she pressed closer, her body fitting against his with shocking perfection, Jacob understood that he was lost, beyond redemption. This was not the gentle, familiar love he had shared with Sarah. This was something wilder, more dangerous, a flame that threatened to consume everything in its path. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jacob saw his own wonder reflected in Rosa's eyes. The house around them seemed different somehow, charged with new possibility and terrible risk. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly under the climbing sun, indifferent to human passion and human folly alike. But inside, in the space between heartbeats, Jacob and Rosa had created something that transcended the boundaries of race and law and social convention, something that would either save them or destroy them both, and in that moment, neither of them cared which it would be.